Your dad was some war hero, huh? Sure, kid, and I'm a Navy SEAL, Officer Daniels sneered. The 8-year-old boy remained silent. His tiny fingers only gripped the dog tag tighter, the final memento of a father taken too soon. The people in the waiting room chuckled at the naive kid with his unbelievable stories. Nobody took him seriously. Then, the station doors slammed open. A highly decorated colonel entered, ribbons and medals shimmering on his chest. The entire room fell quiet as he strode across the floor, not toward the desk, nor the officers, but directly to the boy, and he gave him a salute first. If you believe, respect sometimes skips a generation, only to return with even more power. Comment below. It was an ordinary morning in the city, but for Sarah Cole, it was anything but. The police station's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh light on the quiet room. Matthew Cole, her 8-year-old son, sat on a bench, staring into space, gripping a small metal object tightly. The dog tag that hung from his neck was the last link to a man he barely remembered, his father, Sergeant Major Benjamin Cole. For Matthew, the dog tag wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of love, sacrifice, and a hero's memory that he had to carry alone. Sarah stood at the front desk, speaking to an officer about the break-in at their home. It had happened earlier that morning. Some burglars had taken what they could, but at least Matthew was safe. She struggled to hold it together, her voice betraying the worry she felt. She glanced over at her son, noticing how still he sat. Despite his young age, Matthew was already learning the hard truths about the world. Officer Daniels, a man with 2 decades of experience in the force, approached the desk. He was large and imposing, but there was a certain air of superiority that clung to him. His eyes wandered toward Matthew, noticing the dog tag around the boy's neck. A slight smirk appeared on Daniels's face as he stepped closer. "What's that you've got there, kid?" the officer asked, a mocking tone coloring his voice. Matthew slowly looked up, his face calm, his eyes not betraying the weight he carried within them. He didn't flinch under the officer's gaze. "It's my dad's," he said quietly. Daniels raised an eyebrow, a sneer tugging at his lips. "Your dad, huh?" he scoffed. "A hero, I bet. You know what rank he held, kid?" Matthew didn't hesitate. He knew the answer by heart. "He was a sergeant major," the boy replied firmly. The officer chuckled, clearly amused. He leaned back slightly, exchanging a look with the other officers nearby. "A sergeant major, huh?" Daniels repeated, the mockery obvious in his voice. "And how exactly did your dad get that title? Bet he wasn't out there saving lives, like in the movies." Matthew's grip on the dog tag tightened, but he stayed silent for a moment. The hurtful comments didn't seem to affect him as much as they might have affected others. His father's legacy was more important than the officer's sarcastic remarks. "My dad saved lives," Matthew said, his voice steady. "He served in the army. He was a hero." Daniels looked down at him with disdain, clearly unimpressed. He crossed his arms, eyeing the boy from above. "Sure he did, kid, sure. A real hero, I'm sure." Daniels sneered. "I bet you're just repeating what you saw on TV, huh?" The silence in the room grew thicker. The other officers, hearing the exchange, began to look uncomfortable. Some of the civilians glanced nervously at the scene unfolding, but none intervened. It was as if they were waiting for something to break the tension, but it was impossible to ignore the hurt in Matthew's eyes. He wasn't just a child who had watched too many war movies. He was a child carrying the weight of his father's legacy. Sarah, who had overheard the conversation from across the room, felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. Her heart broke as she saw the way the officer was treating her son. She could hardly breathe as the situation escalated. She wanted to step forward, to say something, but all she could do was watch. Matthew's hands remained steady, clutching the dog tag as if it were the only thing anchoring him to a world that didn't seem to care. Sarah took a deep breath and walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. She didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. Officer Daniels, sensing the discomfort around him, let out a low grunt and turned away, walking back to the front desk. But his words had already done their damage. The boy was left with nothing but the weight of his father's memory and the silence of a world that didn't understand. The room fell quiet again, but the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah could feel the unease in her chest, a tight knot she couldn't shake. She had watched her son's face fall as Officer Daniels walked away, the heavy words lingering in the space between them. She knew Matthew didn't fully understand the significance of what had just happened, but Sarah did. The world had a way of dismissing heroes, of mocking those who didn't fit the easy narrative. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Matthew didn't look up. His gaze remained fixed on the floor. Sarah's heart broke for him. He shouldn't have to deal with this. She had promised Ben, her late husband, that she would protect their son from this very kind of cruelty. And now, here they were, trapped in a world that didn't understand. Sarah's thoughts drifted to that fateful night when she had lost Ben. It had been years, but the pain still felt raw. She could still hear his voice, still remember the last kiss they shared before he left for that final mission. Ben had always said that he would come back to them, that he would fight for them, but he hadn't. The phone call had come in the early hours of the morning. The voice on the other end had been steady, professional, but the words had cut deeper than anything she had ever heard. "We regret to inform you that Sergeant Major Benjamin Cole has been killed in action." Sarah had felt the world shatter around her, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't breathe. Her world had turned gray, and every morning after that felt like she was waking up to a nightmare. Matthew had only been a baby when his father left, but somehow he had always known who Ben was. There were the pictures, the stories Sarah told, the quiet moments when she would find her son clutching the dog tag like it was the only thing that could tether him to the memory of his father. Now, sitting in this police station, surrounded by strangers who didn't understand, Sarah wondered if Matthew would ever get the respect he deserved. If anyone would ever truly see him as the child of a hero, instead of just another child lost to the world's indifference. Sarah took a deep breath, pulling herself out of the dark thoughts. She couldn't let this defeat her. Not now. Not in front of Matthew. He needed her strength, her resilience. He needed her to show him that there was still beauty in the world, even if it was hard to find sometimes. She looked at the officer behind the desk, who was busy typing something on his computer. His attention was elsewhere, oblivious to the tension that still hung in the room. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she considered confronting him. She wanted to say something, to make him understand the weight of what had just transpired, but she knew it wouldn't help. The officer's disdain for her son wasn't something that could be fixed with words. It ran deeper than that. The only thing that mattered now was getting out of this place, away from the mocking glances, the coldness, and the judgment. Sarah stood up, offering Matthew her hand. His small fingers wrapped around hers tightly, as if the world outside this room had become a place of uncertainty. "Ready to go home?" Sarah asked softly. Matthew nodded, but his eyes didn't meet hers. He was still lost in the memory of that brief exchange with Officer Daniels, still reeling from the sting of the officer's words. Sarah understood. The things people said weren't always easy to forget, especially when they came from those who were supposed to protect and serve. They left the station in silence, stepping out into the cold air of the city streets. The world outside was still the same, but it felt different somehow. The weight of the morning's events pressed on Sarah's chest, but she kept walking, determined to make it through the day. For Matthew, for Ben. As they made their way to the car, Sarah couldn't help but think of the future. What kind of world would Matthew grow up in? Would he be able to carry the weight of his father's legacy without losing himself along the way? She had no answers, no guarantees. But one thing she did know was that she would be there for him, every step of the way. The sound of the car door closing behind them was a brief moment of solace in the midst of the chaos. But even as they drove away, Sarah's mind couldn't escape the bitter taste of Officer Daniels' words. The world wasn't kind to those who had given so much. It wasn't kind to heroes, and yet Sarah had to believe that there was still goodness to be found, even if it was hard to see. For Matthew's sake, she had to believe that one day people would understand, that one day the world would finally see her son the way he deserved to be seen, as the child of a hero, and not just another victim of a broken system. The car ride home was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the void where words should have been. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white from the tension. Matthew sat beside her, staring out the window, his face a mix of confusion and anger. He didn't fully understand why Officer Daniels had treated them like that, but he could feel it, the unfairness, the coldness in the officer's tone. It was something Sarah couldn't explain, not yet. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah parked the car and turned off the engine. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, now felt too empty, too quiet. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she needed to explain, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her, making it hard to find the right words. Matthew unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the cold air. Sarah followed him, watching as he walked slowly toward the front door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She hated seeing him like this, but she knew he needed time to process everything that had happened. Inside, Sarah hung up her coat and went to the kitchen, pulling out a glass of water. She took a long sip, the cool liquid doing little to ease the tightness in her chest. The memory of Officer Daniels's disdainful words echoed in her mind. This is the real world, kid. People don't care about your father's medals. They care about what you can do for them. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her like that, dismissively, as if her husband's sacrifice meant nothing. She had been prepared for some level of disrespect, but not from someone in law enforcement, not from someone who was supposed to protect people like her, people like Ben. Sarah set the glass down with a soft clink, her mind racing. She had to do something. She couldn't let this go, not without a fight. Her husband's memory, her son's future, deserved more than to be brushed aside by ignorance. The phone on the kitchen counter rang, cutting through her thoughts. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before picking it up, unsure if she was ready for another round of disappointment. Hello? Her voice was strained, as if she already knew what the call was about. Is this Sarah Cole? A woman's voice asked on the other end. Yes. Who is this? Sarah's eyes flickered toward the door where Matthew had gone to his room. My name is Evelyn Williams. I'm a lawyer with the Veterans Rights Alliance. We heard about what happened today at the police station, and I think we might be able to help. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A lawyer? She hadn't expected this, but it was exactly what they needed. The words help and justice sounded so foreign, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't think there was much I could do, she said softly. You'd be surprised, Evelyn replied. There's a lot we can do when it comes to protecting the rights of veterans and their families. It's time we hold people accountable. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling a rush of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Ben's death. Anger, sorrow, but also a flicker of determination. For the first time in a long while, Sarah didn't feel alone. She felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The following days passed in a blur. Sarah spent every waking hour researching veterans' rights, learning about the intricacies of the legal system, and trying to keep a semblance of normalcy for Matthew. But inside, she felt like she was drowning. Every time she thought about what had happened at the police station, her hands would tremble, and her stomach would twist in knots. She was angry, so incredibly angry, but she couldn't let it consume her. Not yet. Evelyn Williams, the lawyer from the Veterans Rights Alliance, had been in constant contact with her. They discussed the details of the incident over and over, each conversation bringing more clarity but also more frustration. It wasn't just that Officer Daniels had been rude. It was that he had openly disregarded everything Sarah had stood for. He had disrespected her family's sacrifices. It was personal now. Sarah sat in her living room one evening, a stack of papers spread out before her. Matthew had gone to bed early, as he had been doing for the past few days, his silence growing heavier with each passing hour. She couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed, the last time he'd let himself be a kid. The joy seemed to have drained from him, just as it had from her. The doorbell rang, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and for a moment, she hesitated. When she opened the door, standing before her was Evelyn, dressed in a professional suit but with a warm smile. "You ready to start this fight?" Evelyn asked, her voice confident yet kind. Sarah nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She had been ready for this moment since the call. But now that it was real, the weight of what they were about to undertake felt immense. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Sarah said, as they sat down at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It's not just about the police. It's about what happens to people like Ben when they come back. It's about the way they're treated, like they don't matter anymore, like they're just invisible." Evelyn listened intently, nodding as Sarah spoke. "It's not just veterans," Evelyn replied. "It's anyone who's different. The system doesn't know how to handle people who don't fit its mold, but we can make them listen. We have the law on our side." Sarah leaned forward, her voice low but filled with a new kind of resolve. "I won't let them forget. I won't let them erase Ben's sacrifice. And I won't let my son grow up in a world where this is okay." Evelyn smiled, a quiet pride in her eyes. "That's the spirit. This is going to be tough, but it's worth it. For Ben, for Matthew, for every person who's been ignored by the system." As the two women discussed their next steps, Sarah felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for a future where Matthew would understand the true meaning of sacrifice, honor, and resilience. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal motions, public statements, and media coverage. Sarah knew the battle for justice was far from over, but each step forward felt like a victory in itself. Evelyn and the Veterans' Rights Alliance had done everything they could to get the story out there. And soon, Sarah's story was all over the news. The video of Ben's encounter with Officer Daniels had gone viral, sparking outrage across the country. It wasn't just about a single officer's mistake anymore. It was about the systemic issues that veterans faced daily. On the morning of the first big protest, Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting her blouse. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't just Sarah anymore. She was something more: an advocate, a mother, a voice for the silenced. She hadn't anticipated the weight of that responsibility when this all began, but she understood it now. Matthew had begged her to stay home, to keep him safe from the public attention. But Sarah couldn't. She knew what had happened to Ben was not just about him. It was a symptom of something bigger, something that needed to be confronted head-on. The rally was taking place outside the police station where Officer Daniels worked. The crowd was a mix of veterans, activists, and regular citizens who had been moved by the injustice. As Sarah made her way through the sea of people, her eyes locked onto familiar faces, fellow military families, people who understood her pain. Evelyn found her in the crowd, her face a picture of determination. "You ready?" Evelyn asked, her voice cutting through the noise. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. This wasn't just about Ben anymore. It wasn't even just about her. It was about every veteran who had been marginalized, every family who had been affected by the system's disregard. As they stood together, a chant rose from the crowd: "Justice for veterans! Justice for Ben! Justice for all!" The chant sent a ripple through Sarah's chest, a mixture of pride and sadness. Ben had given so much, and this was what it had come to. Sarah stepped forward, microphone in hand. Her voice trembled slightly. At first, but as she spoke, her confidence grew. "We stand here today not just for Ben, but for all the veterans who have been silenced, ignored, and mistreated. We stand for the families who have watched their loved ones come home from war, only to be abandoned by the very system they fought to protect." Her words hit home,
and the crowd responded with a wave of applause. The pain my family has gone through is not an isolated incident.
It's happening all over this country, to men and women who gave everything for us. We will not let their sacrifices be forgotten. We will not let their voices be drowned out by the system that was supposed to protect them. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She hadn't expected to feel such a powerful connection to the people around her, but she did. They were in this fight together, and together they could make a difference. After the rally, as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Ben's old platoon leader. "We've got your back, Sarah. Whatever it takes, we'll be there." The message was simple, but it carried so much weight. Sarah knew in that moment that she wasn't fighting alone. She had the support of not only her family, but an entire community of people who understood what it meant to sacrifice everything for a cause. The weeks that followed the protest were a blur of media interviews, legal proceedings, and constant pressure. But despite the mounting challenges, Sarah could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The tide was turning. People were beginning to listen. What had started as a personal crusade for justice for her son had grown into a movement. The voices of veterans, military families, and supporters rang louder every day. One evening, Sarah sat in the small, dimly lit living room of their apartment, watching the evening news. She'd never been one to seek the spotlight, but there was something powerful in seeing her own face on television, her words echoing across the country. It was strange, almost surreal, but she knew it was necessary. The anchor's voice cut through her thoughts. In breaking news, the ongoing protests for veteran rights have gained unprecedented momentum. Today, the family of Ben Tanner, a veteran severely injured while serving overseas, took a stand outside the police station where the controversial altercation with Officer Daniels took place. Mrs. Tanner called for accountability and reform, a message that has resonated with people across the nation. She is now calling for a full investigation into the systemic issues affecting veterans. The report continued, but Sarah barely heard it. Her mind was already racing ahead. What would happen next? Could they really make a difference? Or was this all just a fleeting moment of public attention? Her phone buzzed again, snapping her back to reality. It was Evelyn. "We need to talk. The lawyer wants to meet tomorrow." Something big is happening. Sarah's stomach dropped. Every time the lawyer called, it felt like the ground beneath her shifted. The stakes had never been higher. The next morning, Sarah met with Evelyn and the lawyer, a man named Richard Green, who had been guiding them through the legal labyrinth of this fight. Richard was an experienced civil rights attorney, but even he seemed a little shaken when he sat down with them. "We've been approached by the press, and there's a lot of pressure coming from both sides," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "But there's something else. We have an opportunity to take this case to a national level. The Department of Veterans Affairs has reached out, offering support for your case, Sarah. But they want something in return." Sarah's heart raced. She knew the Department of Veterans Affairs wasn't exactly known for its proactive stance on veteran welfare. What could they possibly want in exchange for their support? "What do they want?" she asked, her voice steady, though her insides were in turmoil. Richard looked uncomfortable. "They want you to soften the message. They want you to make this about the individual officer, not about the systemic failures of the police force, or the larger issues facing veterans. They want to avoid a full investigation into the corruption and mismanagement that's been plaguing the system for years." Sarah's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. On one hand, having the Department of Veterans Affairs behind them could bring even more attention and resources to the case. But on the other, it felt like an attempt to water down everything they had fought for. "I won't back down," she said firmly. "We're not here just for Ben. We're here for every veteran who's been mistreated and ignored. I'm not going to let them make this about one bad cop. It's bigger than that." Evelyn nodded in agreement. Richard didn't say anything, but Sarah could see the weight of her words had hit him. They left the meeting knowing they had a tough battle ahead. But for Sarah, there was no other choice. The fight was no longer just about her family. It was about every family that had ever been let down by the system they had once trusted. The days following the tense meeting with the Department of Veterans Affairs were filled with intense preparation. Sarah's resolve only grew stronger. The stakes were higher than ever, but the weight of the decision she'd made settled like a heavy cloak around her shoulders. She would not compromise her mission, no matter the cost. The movement had taken on a life of its own, and the voices of countless veterans and families had been heard. But that didn't mean everything was going to be easy. If anything, the opposition was starting to organize as well. Rumors spread of backlash from influential figures in the police force, political leaders who were quietly pressuring the press to shift the narrative. Sarah felt the pressure mounting, but it was nothing compared to the fire she'd ignited inside herself. One afternoon, as she was scrolling through her phone, a notification appeared. A new headline read, "Veteran's Widow Demands Justice for Fallen Soldier. Is the nation ready for change?" Her heart pounded as she read the article. The piece was fair, but it was clear that the author's voice had been influenced by the stories and interviews Sarah had shared. Her fight was resonating, and now it had moved beyond just a local issue. It was on the national stage. Later that day, Evelyn called her. "Sarah, we've just received a huge offer from a media outlet. They want to cover the entire story, starting with your journey. A documentary-style special. It's a huge platform for the cause." Sarah paused, considering. She didn't want this to become a spectacle. It was never about the fame or the attention. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how powerful the exposure could be for the cause. She could reach millions, not just to shed light on her son's tragic experience, but to amplify the voices of all the veterans who had been silenced for too long. "Do we have the time to think it over?" Sarah asked quietly. "They need a decision fast. They're moving quickly," Evelyn replied. The urgency in her friend's voice made Sarah's heart race. This was it. The moment that could push them over the edge into a national reckoning. But as always, there was the fear of exploitation. Could the cause remain pure amid such overwhelming media scrutiny? "I'll need to sleep on it," Sarah said firmly. "We can't rush this. The message has to be clear, and I need to be certain of what we're getting into." As the evening stretched on, Sarah couldn't shake the weight of the choice before her. She walked through their quiet apartment, glancing at Ben's military photos on the walls, his medals shining brightly in their frames. This was for him. This was for every soldier who'd been forgotten, misjudged, or left behind. Ben had always stood for something greater than himself, a man of integrity, honor, and loyalty. His memory was what kept her fighting, even when the world seemed to be spinning out of control. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that taking this step was necessary. If they didn't stand now, if they didn't keep pushing forward, then what would all of their efforts have been for? The decision was made. The next morning, she called Evelyn and Richard. She was ready. They would take the offer. But this time, they would control the narrative. Sarah would ensure that the focus stayed on the truth, on the systemic issues, on the lack of accountability, and on the broken promises to veterans. With one last deep breath, she set her phone down. There was no turning back now. The fight was only just beginning. The media frenzy that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The documentary aired on primetime television, reaching millions across the country. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of viewers voiced their support, sharing their stories of similar injustices, of veterans forgotten or mistreated. The hashtag #VeteransDeserveMore went viral, flooding social media feeds with the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. As the weeks passed, the momentum only grew. Sarah found herself in meetings with senators, lawyers, and policymakers. The issue had reached the highest levels of government, and the pressure on the Department of Veterans Affairs was building to a boiling point. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a symbol of resistance, of justice, of unwavering resolve. However, even with all the attention and growing support, there were moments when Sarah felt the weight of it all. She often found herself looking at Ben's medals, the reminder of what she was fighting for. But she never wavered. With every setback, with every door that was slammed in her face, she became more determined. Her husband had always believed in the power of the people, in the strength of unity. Sarah was now living that belief, seeing firsthand how voices, once quiet, could create a roar too loud to ignore. It was late one evening when she received the call. A compromise had been reached. The Department of Veterans Affairs would conduct an independent review of all cases of mishandled benefits and claims. There would be new protocols put in place to ensure that veterans were given the care and respect they deserved. The law was going to change. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened to the words. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was a victory, a tangible one. As the story of Ben and the countless other veterans came to a close, Sarah realized that the battle wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every veteran who had ever been overlooked, to every family who had ever felt forgotten. Her fight had sparked a nationwide movement that transcended her grief. The following weeks were filled with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The media coverage slowly faded, but the changes that were set into motion were irreversible. Veterans, their families and supporters stood united, knowing that this was just the beginning. The system would be held accountable, and veterans would no longer be left behind. Sarah had played a part in that change, and as for her personal healing, though the ache of losing Ben would never fully go away, it had been replaced by something else. A sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than herself. She had fought for the memory of her husband, for all the veterans who had suffered, for every family who had been touched by loss. In the quiet moments, Sarah could almost hear Ben's voice in her mind, telling her that she had done something good, something right. That was enough. She had won the fight. And though the battle was over, the legacy of what she had started would continue to echo for generations. If Sarah and Ben's story moved you, don't forget to share this video with others who need to hear this message. Every voice matters, and together we can keep fighting for the justice our heroes deserve. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the perfect time. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on the journey of veterans and the next chapters of this story.